Well, thank you for being here, Cecile.
It's great to be here. Thanks.
So I'm wondering, how do you define success?
I think success is really setting your goals, and then whether they're big or small, and just going for them and not giving up. I think that so many things, and I talk about this some in my book, it's just things that seem impossible at the time, but if you just keep trying, eventually you win, and that's I think where most success comes from.
Why did you decide to name it Make Trouble?
Well, I think it's because I think troublemaking has actually led to a lot of the progress we've made in this country. You know, I think about even 100 years ago, before, when Planned Parenthood started, women couldn't even vote, right? We didn't have the right to anything. And it really was because people made trouble and women went to jail and they challenged the laws and defied convention that women made progress. And so I think it's, as my friend Congressman John Lewis would say, it's like about making good trouble. And I think when you do and really stand up for things you believe, that's how we make progress.
Yeah, and you've never been afraid to be polarizing. Like, for example, like feminist icon Gloria Steinem, she's called you, quote, the best teacher on earth, someone you trust. Then you have the National Review's editor, Rich Lowry, saying, a skilled defender of the indefensible. How have you dealt with such extreme perceptions of yourself?
Well, I think if you meet me, that's not really what I'm like. And like everyone else, I mean, I want to, I don't want to intentionally cause trouble. I really just want to make sure that we stand up for the values that we believe in. And I've had the really good fortune. I've led a very privileged life. You know, I've gotten to choose the work I do. And I hope every job I've had has been a little bit about trying to push the ball forward, particularly for folks who may not have the same opportunities that I've had. Sometimes that's women, sometimes that's working people, sometimes that's immigrants. And as my mom said, you know, you can go a lot of places, you can be, I guess, successful or make a lot of money, but there's nothing quite like having a job where people actually say to you, thanks for making my life better. And I've been real privileged to do that. So
is that what drives you, hearing from those people?
Well, it really does, I think, in the sense of like, why are we on this earth? And, you know, I've worked with a lot of people who didn't have any choice in what they did. I worked with women who were nursing home workers, women who worked in hotels, janitors who basically cleaned buildings, worked 2 jobs just to support their family. And it really taught me a lot about how much opportunity I had to do anything I wanted to with my life. And so when you do have that chance, I think it's on all of us to make the decisions about how we want to use our time on this earth. And again, I don't make any bones about it. I've been very lucky because I've always had the opportunity to do what I really felt like was important, and again, make things a little bit better for some other folks.
Yeah. So it's like a really fundamental drive. Like, what are we even here for? Let's do something about it.
Yeah. And you know, it's funny, when I started my first nonprofit, this little dinky nonprofit in Texas, and I had no idea what I was doing. But
when was that?
Oh, my God. That was years ago, although it's now been operating for decades. So it was right after my mom lost her reelection. And I just felt like, wow, someone needed to do something about public education and standing up for some basic civil liberties. I really didn't know what I was doing, but I did it anyway. And it was funny, during the time, older men would come and say, hey, could I, you know, they'd had very successful careers in banking or industry. And they'd come and say, like, could I just come volunteer with you guys? Because I think they were at a point in their life where they thought, wow, what is it all about? And so I've always tried to kind of keep that in mind, is that this is the only life you have, so you got to make the most of it.
And did you have this kind of streak in you when you were a kid?
Well, my parents, of course, were complete troublemakers. My dad, we lived in Dallas, Texas, and it was pretty conservative. And my parents were very liberal. My dad was a civil rights lawyer, and he was actually defending conscientious objectors to the Vietnam War. My mother was, she was just a rabble-rouser. I mean, she was a housewife, but she was fighting for the farm workers, and she was, when the women's movement came to town, she just jumped, you know, head first. And so I think as a kid, and I have, you know, siblings, all of us just saw our parents and saw like politics it wasn't drudgery or it wasn't dirty. It was actually where all the action was. And so I think it was kind of logical that I chose this path.
Yeah. And even like, as you were saying, growing up in Dallas, controversy wasn't a problem. It was something you were comfortable with, right?
Well, and it's something you had to do. I mean, again, that was a time in which, like, everything was segregated. The schools were segregated. The pools were segregated. I mean, people of color in Dallas had very few options. And I know we've made progress, not enough. And women, I mean, none of the women and none of the moms I knew had the chance to work outside the home. So there's just a lot of things where people had to really fight to say, you know what, we need more opportunity. And of course, my mom began to take her own path, as you probably know, and finally kind of left that life as a housewife, which was rewarding but not enough for her, and eventually ran for office herself.
Yeah, so your mom, Governor Ann Richards, served as governor from 91 to 95.
Correct.
And when you got to see this transformation throughout your childhood of her ascent through politics,
right?
What was that like, even when you started to join her as a kid, like with this activism?
Well, it was kind of amazing. And I think one of the things I learned from it, and perhaps it's applicable to some of the folks who might read the book or be watching this, is that no one ever thought she could do what she said, what she thought she could do. I mean, there had never been a woman elected in her own right in Texas as governor. And my mother was like completely the wrong profile. I mean, she was a liberal. She was divorced. She was a recovering alcoholic. And we never had a poll showing that she could win. And the fact is, she just did it anyway because she thought it needed doing. And I think like a lot of women who run for office or maybe get into business, they look at who's in the job and they think, well, I think I could do a better job. And that really was what motivated her. And of course, we did win that election. And what we're seeing today is, of course, women winning elections that no one thinks they can win. So I think it's a lesson for us to, don't ever let your practicality sort of step on your idealism or what you really think you need to do and want to do, because that's the only way things happen.
And even before that, when you were a teenager, for example, were you like joining her in her political activism?
Well, it really wasn't. It's interesting. I went away to college. I kind of escaped Texas. I'd never lived outside of the state. And I went pretty much as far as you can go. I went to Rhode Island. And
to Brown.
To Brown. And that was the first time my mother had run for anything. She was running for county commissioner. And so it was all very different. And then, of course, whenever she ran for something else, we'd all come home and help her out. So it was really very late, in my life that she became this feminist icon before she'd kind of just been mom. But I think it's another lesson that I hope that she showed and that women are seeing, which is it's never too late to have a great life or to do what what you're destined to do.
Yeah. And when you were at Brown sophomore year,
yes,
you thought you dropped out, actually, right?
I did.
Yeah.
I did. Yeah.
Why'd you make that decision?
I guess I had never been away from home. And there was a labor strike, actually. The janitors at Brown went on strike, and I had never been involved in anything like that, but I got very deeply involved because my own janitor, who had been, cleaning our dormitory, was now out on the picket line. And I was somewhat disillusioned. I thought, wow, are these the values of my university? I think I probably just need to get out and kind of get my head clear. So I went to Washington and worked for a nonprofit. And then I eventually came back to Brown and made a lot of trouble, but also got my degree. But it was a really great education. I think it was, for me, a lot of the education we get in life is not necessarily what's being taught in the classroom. It's the experiences we get outside of that. And that was absolutely true at Brown.
What was it like returning to Brown? How was it different after you had this experience?
I think one is I just had the confidence to sort of question authority and stand up for the things I believed in. I got very involved in the divestment movement. Brown was one of the first universities to divest from South Africa, which was sort of the
Could
big.
you explain? Yeah.
Yes, I know. It's like seems like ancient history now, but at the time, I mean, it's relevant because of what young people are doing on campus now. But one of the international movements to support folks in South Africa that were trying to overthrow the apartheid government, or at least change and have a democracy, was to get universities to divest their holdings in South Africa. And believe me, at the time, people said students were crazy. It would never happen. It was disruptive, fill in the blank. And we did it anyway. And it was really it was a great experience. I learned so much. I mean, I learned a lot about Africa. I learned a lot about organizing. And of course, eventually Brown did divest, and then several universities divested. And now as they write the story of what happened in South Africa, I've learned, as others have, just how critical actually that movement, that global movement was. And years later, in a sort of interesting twist of fate, they gave Nelson Mandela an honorary degree at Brown. So that's another theme of the book, which is that, you lose, and then you win. And it's a big difference. And I think if you're really fighting for something that you really believe in, sometimes it's really hard and you don't always win. but eventually you make progress, and that was a good example to me.
When do you think you first realized that you have to not let things get you down, that you have to take a long-term perspective?
Well, probably another unsuccessful thing I did at Brown. I was involved in the anti-nuclear movement to try to keep the Seabrook nuclear plant from being built, and I think it's now been operating for decades. So sometimes you just lose, and you just have to keep going on. But also, I realized, when I left Brown, I became probably an unlikely path for a Brown graduate. I became a union organizer. I worked for garment workers in the southern United States and in Texas and along the Rio Grande border. And I realized this is going to be a long haul. These are women who had been working at minimum wage for decades, and to make a change in their life was going to take a long, long time. And probably it helped me be, I guess, a tad more patient than I was in college, realizing that this is this is work that you have to be committed to for your life. And so I have been.
When you were offered the role at Planned Parenthood in 2006, it would have required moving from D.C. to New York,
right,
uprooting your family.
Right.
So you called your mom for some advice. What was that call like?
Well, the truth was, and I think this is relevant for women who are trying to think about what to do next, I wasn't so much moving, although I had to break that to my kids. It was just that I didn't think I was skilled enough to take the job. I mean, I had run smaller nonprofits, but I had never raised that much money, been responsible for a huge national organization with this, almost 100-year history. And so I'm sure I was afraid of failing. And so I called my mom and she said, get over yourself. You never know unless you try. And the things you really regret in life are the chances that you didn't take. And so I went for the job interview. And then lo and behold, 12 years later, I've been had the honor of being the president of Planned Parenthood and really having a window into some of the most important work happening for women in the country.
And when you got this advice from your mom, I'm sure that she was always a go-to person for advice, right?
Well, and she had a lot of advice.
Yeah.
Yes. That was something everyone will agree on. Yes. Right.
Yeah. What do you think maybe is the single best piece of advice that she gave you in your life?
Well, I think, and I know I mentioned earlier that for her, she spent a lot of years just doing what society expected her. She was supposed to raise kids, be a perfect wife, throw the perfect dinner party. And she did that for several years. And it wasn't until she had the chance to kind of break out and do what she wanted to do for her. I think she was always regretful that she, missed some time and didn't always, that she let social convention get in the way. So her best advice was, this is the only life you have. So do it. And whatever it is, never turn down a new opportunity. And, she used to say when I was worried about taking a new job, or other women who would say, I'm not sure if I'm qualified, she'd say, look, what's the worst thing that could happen? And I think that's really good advice to just think about when you're thinking about starting a new business or changing jobs. It's just, what's the worst thing that could happen? Because usually once you can imagine that, it's not that bad.
And so what ultimately drew you to the Planned Parenthood job?
Well, of course, like a lot of women, or like 1 in 5 women in the country, I'd been a Planned Parenthood patient when I was at Brown. That's where I got my birth control. And so I knew about the organization, had been a supporter. And to me, it was one of the most important organizations in the country in terms of helping women live out their lives and have opportunity to finish school and start a career and support a family. So to me, there was no question that if this is something I could do, it would be such an honor. And the job has been big and challenging, but I never even imagined how great it would be. So I'm so glad that I did go for that interview, and obviously glad they chose me.
And you were tasked with kind of making it more political, right? Bringing it back to its activist roots.
I think I think one of the challenges that Planned Parenthood had was we were an excellent healthcare provider. We provide healthcare to about 2.5 million people every year, but politics was getting in the way. I mean, more and more laws were being passed and restrictions. And so I think it was not necessarily to be more political, but just to really rebuild our movement roots. But then there were other things that we figured out too, like we needed to use technology more and invest in new ways of getting care to people, which I'm proud to say we really have done. Invest in young people, a whole new generation of young people as patients, because they want different things than young people did when Planned Parenthood was started, or even when I went to college at Brown. So that has been part of the exciting thing, is just thinking about healthcare delivery in a new way. as well as bringing in another generation of activists.
And what was the biggest challenge that you faced as the head of it?
I mean, I think the biggest challenge is the disruption in the healthcare world. And we specialize in serving folks that don't have a lot of options often. Sometimes they're uninsured, they're younger, they may be more mobile. And it's the healthcare system, hasn't always been an easy place to navigate. And so one of the most exciting things, I write about this in the book, was the fight for the Affordable Care Act, because it seemed like such a chance to finally get some equity for women in the healthcare system. And I'm proud to say that we did. We made a lot of progress, and that has fundamentally changed life, not only for women that come to Planned Parenthood, but millions of others. The most successful moment, I think, of my life was the day that President Obama called me, and I talk about this and said, he was about to announce that now all women that get insurance would get birth control covered at no cost. That has been revolutionary for women. And we're now at like a 30-year low for unintended pregnancy in this country, and I'm really, really proud of that.
Yeah, can you tell me a little bit more about what that fight was like?
Yeah, no, well, I mean, I think it was a good lesson in that sometimes you have to fight with your friends, not just people who are your opponents, because getting this done was a big lift. And we had
within the Democratic Party,
within Congress, within the White House, because no one wants, if something's really hard to get, no one wants to give it up for free. And we really did have to mobilize young people on college campuses dressed up in giant pill packs and, agitated, came to Congress, wrote to the White House. And so it did take a lot. And you may even remember there was a moment in which Congress was holding a hearing about whether birth control should be covered. They refused to let a Georgetown law student testify because they said they needed experts. And when we saw the panel of experts, there was one thing they had in common, and that is they'd never used birth control because they were all men. We really had some pretty big obstacles. But I think the exciting thing is now, and of course, unfortunately, this administration is trying to unravel this birth control benefit. But once you win something that big, it's much harder to take it away. I mean, women in this country are very aware of what that means for them, to be able to have that economic freedom and access to care.
So are you worried about the future of Planned Parenthood and any of the accomplishments that you made with it?
Well, I mean, nothing's ever finished, so we always have more progress to make. But one of the reasons I felt like I could leave after 12 years is the organization is as strong as it's ever been. We have more than 11 million supporters. We're delivering healthcare all across the country. We're delivering healthcare in some states online. Birth control is getting better. I feel really hopeful. And most importantly, we have a generation of young people who are their own advocates. And that to me is, you marry that with the excellent healthcare we provide. I feel good about the future, even though I'm sure there are going to be battles ahead.
Yeah, and you explained in the book this meeting that you had with Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump,
right?
Where they invited you. What was that about? That was shortly after Trump's inauguration.
Yeah, actually it was actually before the inauguration.
Okay,
I think
sorry.
That's okay. No, but it was right around that time, and I may have that wrong. But basically, they wanted to meet about Planned Parenthood because I think they knew this was going to be. I mean, Paul Ryan had already declared they're going to defund Planned Parenthood, and so even though I was frankly a little anxious about having that meeting because I didn't know what to expect, I felt like it was, I owed it to our patients to try. But in the end, I really believe what Jared Kushner expressed is that he wanted us to quit providing abortion services to women in this country in exchange for keeping our public funding. And I just said, we really stand for the right of women to get the reproductive health care they need, and that's a legal service, and it's really important that women can get it, and we're not going to trade that off for money. So it didn't go that well, but at the end of the day, we were able to mount a campaign with hundreds of thousands of people around the country that supported Planned Parenthood and able to keep our public funding, and I hope we continue to do so because it makes a big difference. A lot of women who come to us, we're their only healthcare provider.
Yeah. So when you were having that conversation,
mm-hmm.
what was going through your head when this proposal was made?
I just said, look, I thought this is my chance to educate the two of them about who we see, what we do, and, of course, re-educate them if they needed to know that federal funding doesn't go for abortion services. So, in fact, the money that they were talking about cutting off from Planned Parenthood provides access to breast cancer screenings and birth control and STI testing and treatment. And again, for a lot of the women and young people who come to us, there's no one else in town to do that work. So even though they understood that, I felt like they were trying to make kind of a political deal, and that's just not who we are at Planned Parenthood.
Yeah. Was this an example of how you have always had to kind of balance politics with your personal ideals and then leading an organization? Well,
it's interesting because I have been through congressional hearings. I've done a lot of other things in this 12 years at Planned Parenthood. I think the thing that's important to me is that we always keep women at the center of everything we do, decisions we make and positions we take. And so for me, it isn't hard. It's not a political game. It's actually about women whose health and sometimes their lives are at stake. And I think if we can continue to try to lift up their stories and create more empathy in this country for what women need, which is basically access to affordable health care no matter where they live, no matter their immigration status, their geography, their income, then we'll have done the right thing. So I just try to keep that in mind.
When did you decide that you were going to step down from Planned Parenthood?
Well, after we beat back this effort to defund Planned Parenthood, I felt like, we sort of got, and that was with the help of two really important Republican senators.
Which senators?
Yes, Susan Collins from Maine and Lisa Murkowski from Alaska. Yes, I mean they are national heroines to me in terms of really standing up for women in their caucus. But once that happened, I had really made a commitment to invest in a new generation of leaders. And even though it's really hard to leave an organization that you love, I think it's important to demonstrate sometimes that you can step aside and let someone else take the reins. And so we'll have a really smooth transition at Planned Parenthood. A lot of women are interested, and I'm probably some men interested in this job, and that's great. And I will tell them I will be cheering on the sidelines every step of the way for what they do next.
Did you remember the exact moment when you made that decision?
No, it really wasn't an exact moment. I had always been thinking that, 10 years is a long time to do this job. I stayed an extra 2. And I could have stayed longer, but I really felt like it just felt right for me, and it felt right for the organization too. I think it's the right time.
So what's next for you?
I don't know. And that's kind of exciting too. I've been a little bit of an entrepreneur in the past. I've started nonprofits and I've been always involved in movements. There's a lot of work that needs to be done in this country, I think. And one of the things I'm most focused on right now is making sure that every single person is registered to vote and that they vote this November. I really think we need to restore democracy in the sense of having people not only have the right to vote, but then exercising that right. And I think if we do, I think we can change the direction in some of the areas that I'm concerned about.
Are you going to run for office at some point?
Well, that's not really in my plan, but you never want to say never. That's one thing my mother told me, right? Is never turn down a new opportunity. But I am excited about all the women running for office, twice as many women running for Congress as 2 years ago. Up and down the ticket. I mean, there's all kinds of women running. And so I'd love to do everything I can to help them, support them, and again, just change the face of who's in office a bit.
Who are some specific candidates that come to mind?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, there are 2 women that actually, their races are already done. They just won. They'll be the first 2 Latinas ever to go to Congress from Texas. That's huge. I mean, it's incredible that it took us that long. But they're women. They're women all over. Planned Parenthood employees that are running for office. Ana Escamami, a young woman in Florida running for the state house. Nikema Williams, who just got elected to the state Senate in Georgia. So it's exciting to me just to see women not waiting their turn, not waiting, asking for permission. And as I say, they're starting even before they're ready. And it's about time.
Yeah. So throughout your career, whether you were with unions or even with the Democratic Party or with Planned Parenthood, you've gravitated towards jobs that have had like lots of intense opposition, sometimes even violent threats. Do you seek out jobs that have that type of thing? That
you think I'm just like a magnet for controversy?
Well, yeah, where you want to there's a struggle involved.
Well, I guess I think that, again, going back to the theme is like, this is the only life you have. You really should stand up, I believe, if you can, if you have the privilege that I have, and really stand up for the things that you believe in and fight hard for hard stuff. I think if it's easy, someone else has probably already done it. And so it's not that I'm a glutton for controversy, but I do think when it comes to LGBTQ rights, when it comes to women's rights, when it comes to the right of everyone to have equal pay and a fair chance, those are hard fights. And I know we've learned, people don't give up power without a fight. I really would love to see if I think about all the time I've spent in Congress fighting for women's access to affordable health care and just access to be able to make their own decisions about their health care. I feel like I'd love to be still alive to see the day when half of Congress could get pregnant. And then I think we'd finally quit fighting about birth control and reproductive health care. So I that may be inciting controversy, but I think it really more is just hoping for a world that can be a little bit better than it is now.
Yeah. Whereas, like, these are fights worth having. It's not seeking it out. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, definitely not like seeking trouble just for the sake of it. And again, I think some of the most important things that we've been able to do at Planned Parenthood have been to just continue to push the envelope, not sit back and rest on our laurels and say, well, it's good that birth control is legal. It doesn't matter if it's legal if not everyone can get it. And again, I think we're making huge progress, but we're at a record low for teenage pregnancy in the U.S. That's something I'm very proud of. But I will also say it's not equal, that rates of teenage pregnancy are still too high among young women who are with low incomes, young women of color, young women in the southern United States. And so there's just work left to do.
Yeah. And that even gets, again, back to the title of your book. It's knowing when to shake things up in a good way. How do you find what you should be standing for? How should someone look internally for that?
Well, I think for me, I really try to channel the women that I work with, right out of college. I think of the women who are, working double shifts, cleaning hotel rooms, many of them single moms supporting a family. Or I think of some of the immigrant janitors I work with in Los Angeles who were making minimum wage and still sending money back home to support a family that they'd had to leave behind. And I just think, what can we do to make this world more equitable, give everyone equal opportunity, recognizing that I've had enormous privilege in my life, and it's time for me to pay it forward. And that helps me, I think, figure out not only what I've done up to now, but probably what's next.
Yeah. And we've talked a lot about some of the best advice that you've received. What's the worst advice you've been given?
The worst advice I've been given, actually, it's kind of funny. It's a small example, but maybe helpful to some people. I remember when I was in high school and I had read about this college in Providence. I'd never been out of Texas. I didn't know, I could barely find it on a map, but where the students had been really active for students of color, getting more financial aid. And I think they'd taken over the administration building. And I thought, wow, this sounds like my kind of place. So I went to talk to the college counselor at my school. And he looked at me and he said, well, you could never get in there. He said, here are some safety schools. These are the places you should apply. He was definitely trying to take me down a notch. And so I totally ignored him. And I applied anyway. And I got in. And not only did I get in, I had a great education. I met people that changed my life. And 30 years later, I got an honorary degree from Brown. So I feel like those are the things. Sometimes you just have to recognize when people are trying to dampen your expectations or dampen your idealism. I think it's important to stand up for what you believe, even if that means making trouble.
Yeah. What advice would you give to someone who wants to have a career like yours?
I think that if you're really young and just kind of getting started, sometimes it's hard to get into big nonprofits or I think volunteering, finding a cause you care about. I mean, one of my first, before I had a job like this, I remember I volunteered for someone running for city council in Austin. And like 2 days later, I was in charge of the phone bank. It was like, they were just so excited to have a volunteer, and I learned a ton of skills that way. So I think it is important sometimes to just, get on a board of an organization that you care about, throw a fundraiser for them. these are the kinds of things that help you then begin to know, is this the organization you want to be with, or either as a job or just as something you do in your volunteer time. But there's so many opportunities now, and I think there's never been, frankly, a better time to be a volunteer and to stand up for something that you really, really do care about.
Yeah. And when you've been part of all of these different organizations, what would you say is the common thread among all of them?
I think it's to try to get people just a better shake. And really, I hope, whether it's economic opportunity, whether it's, women having equal chance, it's, we're doing better, but we're still not doing, near enough. And one of the things I learned from this, being at Planned Parenthood all these years, is just literally the difference it can make, the fork in the road that someone can be in. And whether they can't get a breast cancer screening, or they did, and therefore Planned Parenthood was able to actually get them the treatment that saved their life, or what it means for a young woman to be able to get affordable health care and get birth control that gets her through college. That can mean the difference about what her opportunities are. And so getting to be part of a movement like that is unbelievably rewarding. I realize it's a huge privilege. And so I always feel like every day I need to pay it back some way.
Was there ever a moment in your life where you questioned this burden that you had?
Well, it's never fully felt like a burden.
Okay.
But I've never tried to take a straight job. That's true. Just like, and also, again, I had the good fortune when I was young, and I write about meeting Kirk, my husband, who is also an organizer. So finding someone that actually has the same ideas and dreams and idealism that you do makes it a lot easier. It was easier to have 3 kids and raise them with someone who understood that sometimes I needed to be, off on a picket line, or, had to, be traveling and doing this. I think we both tried to balance that. But it's meant building a life that really has had great meaning for us. And now, of course, all 3 of our kids I think they're all activists in their own right. And that's the best reward for any parent.
Yeah. It's like the family business.
Well, except it's not a business so much, but yes, it's a family passion. It's a family passion. And look, I'll say there's been some great moments with my kids, but nothing better than all 5 of us being at the inauguration of Barack Obama as president of the United States, because all of them had a role in that, even though the twins weren't even old enough to vote, but they'd volunteered, they door knocked, and it felt like a huge accomplishment.
When you're looking at the entirety of your career so far, what do you think would be a time, maybe your biggest failure, and what that taught you?
So there's been so many. One was I went to work on Capitol Hill, and actually it was a great job.
When was this?
This was, we had moved to Washington, and I can't remember the year, but actually it was when Nancy Pelosi first became the Democratic whip. She was the highest ranking woman ever in Congress, and I'd never worked on Capitol Hill. I had no idea how things worked there, but I thought it was such an opportunity. I learned so much from her. I mean, I spent about 1.5 years on the Hill, and then left to start a new nonprofit. But it was one of these things where, even though I always felt like I was a failure, because there were people there who knew everything about every rule and how Congress worked and all this. So I don't feel like I was successful, but I learned so much from Nancy Pelosi and from the people who had had built their entire career working in government. Some of the most brilliant, passionate people, folks who could gone out and done anything and made a lot more money, but they were committed to public service. And they're still some of my very best friends. So even though I realized it wasn't the job for me, I wouldn't trade that experience for anything. And I think that's also one of the things to learn, is that, you can try something, and even it's okay to say it didn't work out, but you almost get something from every single job or new adventure that you take, even if it doesn't work out in the long run. And Nancy Pelosi is still a really good friend, and frankly, we worked together on passing the Affordable Care Act and a lot of other things. So those relationships have become some of the most important in my life.
And what did that experience teach you specifically going forward?
Well, one was that I wasn't cut out to work in government. I think just wasn't. I was impatient, and I really wanted to be out making things happen. And right then, it was really, really difficult. But I think it reminded me of a lesson that I feel like I've learned and had to relearn, which is anytime you can take a job with someone who can teach you something, go for it. And I learned a lot from her. I learned a lot from the people on the Hill. And so just soaking that up, it was like taking a graduate course in Capitol Hill. And so I think I always advise young women in particular to always look for someone who can be a mentor to you or who can teach you about something that you don't know about, because you never know when that's going to come in handy.
Well, thank you so much, Cecile.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Thank
Great to
you.
be here. Thank you.